Well, I would keep it open. I certainly don't, there's no must or absolute responsibility, and it's very individual, and enough people take it on to make it interesting. So there's no ultimate prescription. But in terms of my own personal curiosity, I had to take on, my body in some way. And when I began the long, epic Iovis project, that was clearly a long meditation on patriarchy and on its different manifestations in my own life, personally in my own culture and this larger culture that I'm in, and all my travels seem to reflect on that theme to some extent. I mean, it was always there in the dynamic, whether I was going to Vietnam or China or parts of Indonesia. So personally, it's been a real investigative project and a kind of intervention in my own, into my own, you could call it mind stream or something. I feel like I have to, keep checking it out. And over a long life in writing and in kind of, in cultural activism, it's, this constant where, where is the female position. And I want to talk about more female psychology, or that in Buddhism, of course, you have this description of male and female energy, which is probably maybe you've heard me talk about this, the upaya, which is the skillful means, and the more male style, and the prajna, which is sort of a womb-like wisdom, and the sort of primordial wisdom that's just a given, and it can be tapped into in many ways, but it's not a quality necessarily of gender. So that always interests me. I look at in my meditation on male energy, I look at my own so-called male energy and my own obsession with accomplishment and deeds and action, and which are qualities of the principle, not of necessarily men or women. So that becomes a dynamic, and then of course the partnership of those energies, and also the transgendering, and the the way that we're open systems, and that energy plays on our bodies differently, I think. But there's certainly in dream states I can seem to be inhabiting a male body or an animal body or a male jaguar body and so on. So it's pretty fluid. I guess I've been drawn to writers who explore some of these issues or questions, especially in in the current times that we're in. And when I was coming of age as a writer, although I had a lot of support from my male colleagues, often I'd be sitting there, I'd be the only woman in the room, and part of the view, I think, for some of these projects I've been involved with is to include, women in a more generous way.
Having had that long-term type of exhaustive study and focus, whether you came to conclusions from that.
Well, I'm very interested to see how my child, of course, is growing through the poem, and so his voice is very much in there from a very early age, saying, "Mommy, mommy, face me, Daddy is the wolf. You're my love, you're my mommy, you're my something, wolf mommy, you grow down to 21 and I'll grow up to 21. I mean, he was saying these things as 4 years old, 5 years old. And then some of his writing is in there, and then to have, the older voice, which is, he's a young man now. So, and that it's a way to trace our experience together in this kind of mother-son dynamic. So that's very, very precious to me. It's interesting to feel how the social and cultural and political dynamic shifts. And in fact, there's more war as you get into the poem. The first book has a lot of reference to World War II, where my father was in Germany, and I was able to interview him before he died. And there's also a section on Vietnam, and then I actually go to Vietnam as a kind of pilgrimage, and then write another section after being there. And the first Vietnam section is called Nam, a history lesson for my son. So again, this almost didactic teaching mode is part of the thrust of the poem. So I'm not only the young seeker and child myself, but I'm also the lover, the wife, the mother, the hag, the nag, so goes through these, speaking of the feminine energy, and the poem, it travels a lot with these different phases of the moon, so to speak. And I'm finishing up the poem. I seem to be finishing up the poem and working on the end of book 3, and the whole thing is supposed to be published. I don't know how, but some big tome by my devoted, wonderful coffee house press editors and folk. So it's very hard to end. I mean, that's, does it really end? Maybe it doesn't really end. Maybe there's a coda. There's a lot of outtakes. When I work with my son Ambrose Bai, who's a musician and composer, I usually start by recording. He'll have me record for him, and I'll have text, and sometimes I will tend to improvise, and he'll focus on things that, do that again, or I like that, or he'll leaf through, text and say, why don't you read this one? And then sometimes I'll listen to some music he has started, and I come up with these ideas, and it's very much created in the studio in a way. For example, there's a piece called Corset, which is for Emma, speaking of, her history of working as a teenager in a corset factory. And so I had this text, and I had this idea of, it comes a little bit out of key figures and women like Susan B. Anthony. She has a whole educational moment. Emma Goldman was. And then, so I said, there's this line, arise, arise. And I started, in this, we were recording actually in his little home studio, and I was going, arise, arise. And he kept, doing it. And then, we went back and forth a little, and I said, what happened to the arise? I want to hear more of that, arise, arise. So then he put in another layer of, and it's my voice repeating. But that was, happening in the moment of the recording. So a lot happens, vocally as well. There's another piece that's on our new CD, which was a journal from a trip to the Ajanta Caves in outside Aurangabad, which is a few hours out of Mumbai in India. And it was a pilgrimage to these beautiful Buddhist caves. And my first response on going into these caves was a gasp. It was literally. And then, so when I was reading the journal, I did the gasp. And so the gasp then becomes, integral to the production of the poem for the CD. And, that doesn't really translate on the page in the same way. So I'm able to play with things with him. I mean, what he's doing inspires me to modal structures and certain kinds of soundings that maybe wouldn't happen. So I would say in most cases, there's a real give and take with the person I'm writing to. Sometimes, for example, I had a whole text called Kali Yuga Poetics, and Steve Clay had sent it to Susan Rothenberg, who's a fantastic artist and painter whose work I love. And she was mainly hanging out in a barnyard doing these portraits of animals. And so she wrote back, and I was sending this manifesto about the Dark Ages and the nightmares to come. And she said, I'm just here hanging out with the animals, the barnyard animals. So I had her send me some of her drawings, and then I wrote to accompany her drawings. I would say again, a meditation on these modalities or non-human temporalities, and that the manatee is kind of the stand-in for all kinds of endangered creatures and life forms. And, it was triggered by a visit to an aquarium in Miami and I've seen manatee in zoos, and there's one I think in Cincinnati in the aquarium there. This particular manatee seems so ancient, and everybody sees them as these ugly, weird, gray. There's some cross between a walrus and a seal, and these sad faces. But I spent, this sort of meditative hour with this female. I'm sure it was a female, and felt some kind of, transference, and I took a vow that I was somehow going to include the manatee. And I was on a residency with some neuroscientist friends, and one of them actually has a manatee brain on his desk, and also tuned me into the sound of the manatee, and it became again this sort of meditation on what I'm calling this sort of the poetics of mirror neurons, or mirror neurons poetics. And these experiments they've been recently doing mainly with chimps, and showing how there's a tremendous empathy between different life forms. And of course, when was that, in the 60s? The Secret Life of Plants, where you could have a thought about a plant, or a plant would have a thought about a brine shrimp, and a brine shrimp would die, and the plant would react. And I mean, the way they cook up these things, I think, has become a little more sophisticated. But so the manatee humanity, again, it comes out of the litany I started with. Man, oh, come to the manatee mind, man's inhumanity to manatee, and the play with these sounds. And there's also a little riff on Om Manatee, Om Mani Padme Hum, which is a real seed mantra in Tibetan Buddhism, the jewel in the lotus. And so this litany, out of which a further hybrid poem developed. And so it's got almost reoccurring prose conversational sections with a friend who sort of morphs. It's dedicated to Stephen Lowe, who was a dear friend, a writer and artist who was very, very close to William Burroughs and worked with Burroughs on some projects, and the writer Carrie Edwards, who was a former student, very interesting writer herself, had gone through, this very intense sex change. And so I thought about that too, the shifting dynamics between, the consciousness of gender, the consciousness of animal form. The manatee actually has more gray matter in the brain than man. And I have this idea that they have a deeper archive than we do, a different kind of archive that has to do with, certain waves of energy and activity. And then there's also information about the manatee and some of the historical data. There's a whole sort of mirror neuron section. There's a section which is sort of a litany with two voices, and there's this kind of female performative voice, like taking a stand. That's in bold letters. Penguin's publishing this in April of 2009, so I'm looking at the proofs right now and some of the design. I have these, any lines become these wavy lines that are like water. So I would call it a narrative poem. Actually, it's a narrative hybrid poem that explores, it's a kind of meditation on this interspecies communication and and it's investigative and query. It's an inquiry really, and it's also got the wolf has a walk-on part because there were some wolf dreams. The lemur has a walk-on thanks to William Burroughs, who was obsessed with lemurs, convinced that they were the most intelligent form on our planet. And he has a little book that sort of promotes lemurhood, and some dreams that come that came out of a Buddhist practice called the Kala Chakra, which is an initiation, and you're supposed to keep track of your dreams, and you're given special sacred grass that you put under your pillow and your mattress, and then you keep track of these dreams. And a lot of the dreams during this particular ceremony related to these animal forms. And there's one that's a very dark dream that has this sort of wolf slaughter of baby cougars, and I mean, just, these Armageddon type dreams. And the Kali Chakra is supposed to be done, the ceremony is supposed to be done in these dark times, because it's about understanding the nature of time, and the nature of time is really the nature of change, and how to work with change and impermanence. So it's a smorgasbord of a lot of trajectories. And no, I'm excited about it. It's got these images from Kiki Smith with the female body under a wolf skin. So again, this sort of morphing of female and animal, and it ends with, there's a section you've probably heard, the Eye of the Falcon, without seal and close the eye of the falcon, and it's a kind of plea at the end of the whole poem. What alarm is sounding deep in the home? So no, it's a performative piece, but it's also very much a conversation, and has this slower quality. I tried to slow down in it. Anyway, I'm excited. I mean, it's something I feel like I'm working on my vow to the Manatee.